learn? What have you learned? That your actions have consequences!
I need to turn Resident Evil 4 down, close Steam, close Live Split, and...
Do it!
Yeah!
He's over here executing Order 66.
You
Be
and all of your
gone,
Jedi friends, including Obi-Wan Kenobi, are now enemies of the Republic.
So Resident Evil 5 is the topic today, everybody.
It's a good game.
We're not even live yet.
Oh. Fucking got me. Never saw it coming.
We didn't even introduce everybody. Alright. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Red Barrel for the win, and I play video games for the YouTube machine.
And I'm Zephyr, and I play video games for the Twitch machine.
And I think Resident Evil 5 is a good game.
We didn't introduce our sound guy.
Oh yeah.
Well,
Everybody's
hello
just-
there.
Yeah.
What's your Twitch, John?
J More Productions.
What's your YouTube? Is it
Oh,
the
it's
same?
also yeah.
That's the same. Go follow him. He's gonna be the
Yeah.
sound guy.
For future reference, on my YouTube channel, links to that shit will be in the description.
Yes. Well, I think you're already in my description, aren't you?
Yes, I have to link everybody in the description every time, though. There is no like set description on YouTube. So
You are not in my description.
F.
Oof.
How could you do this?
Rip.
Ooh.
Thought we were supposed to be partners.
Ooh. I thought I did.
Hello there. Hello there.
Hello there. So yeah, Resident Evil 5 is what we're talking about today. I'm going to be playing the Devil's Advocate. I'm going to be on the side of this game's bad.
Meanwhile, I'm going to talk about the truth and tell you why it's a good game
No,
and a
it's
good
not.
sequel. And you're wrong.
No, you're wrong.
No.
Yeah.
No, just no.
Welcome to the podcast where we just say yes and no the whole time.
Yeah, it's a good argument. First thing we should talk about, every good review that has ever existed starts with story, so let's start there.
Go ahead. It's all you.
Resident Evil 5's story takes place in Africa shortly thereafter the events of Resident Evil 4. We see Chris Redfield come back for the first time since Resident Evil 1, which is a huge thing for the series. It was awesome fanfare. It was good for new players. He was kind of jacked, but it didn't matter. We saw Wesker come back. I mean, it was... Resident Evil is one of those games where the story is written as it is, and it's not really better or worse than it was before.
Wrong.
Right? So, well, no.
Yes.
All right,
wrong.
present.
Resident Evil 5 is more or less just an action game that allows you to play cooperatively with your friends. The majority of the enemies are not scary. Many of the boss fights suck and are easily skipped. And there's an entire water section which is extremely boring and makes the game unrememberable.
Wow, you're describing a bad game that is not what Resident Evil 5 is. It's amazing. Resident Evil 5 was an amazing sequel. The gameplay was super solid. It had everything Resident Evil 4 had, plus more. When Crash Bandicoot 2 and 3 came out, we gave those praise because they were the exact same game with better mechanics, and they did everything that the predecessor did, but better. Right? That's how I feel about Resident Evil 5 gameplay-wise. It's one of the. It just did everything better. It did what worked and what everybody liked, and it did it better. And that's good. Good game.
It did everything better except for tell an engaging story.
It told a very engaging story. One of the most unique settings in Resident Evil history, probably.
No, Resident Evil 7 is the most unique.
No, what? How could you do this? That's painful. That's really painful.
Resident Evil 5 taking place in Africa did nothing for me. It wasn't exciting. The game was brown with more brown. The enemies were forgettable. They were just a clone of Resident Evil 4.
Okay. Again, I defer you to Crash Bandicoot 1 and 2, where it was the exact same game. Or you didn't like Crash Bandicoot, so I defer you to Spyro, where it was the exact same game 3 times in a row, and everybody pissed themselves because it was just the same game but better. Like, okay, I can give an example of Resident Evil 5 being better than 4.
Okay.
there are more melee combat options. You can hit an enemy in the shoulder and right hook them. You can hit them in the leg and stomp them. There are multiple different kinds of melee, and that's just melee. The gun side, there are so many different guns to play with. There's no merchant, but the shop comes back. You can still upgrade everything. There's the landmines. There's unique weapons like the stun rod, which was really interesting. Sheva's bow, which was awesome. It,
From the lens of a
whereas
2021 perspective, more melee combat, especially with how it's added to the game, is unimpressive. You're still using the knife for the majority of quote-unquote melee and hoping for a stagger. And just because your characters are these overpowered brawn machines where you can punch a boulder doesn't make it better.
No. Every enemy you hit in any part of their body staggers, and you can melee anybody at any time. It's extremely interactive. It's more arcadey than Resident Evil 4. It takes the same idea and accelerates it, just like every good sequel does.
But Resident Evil 4 actually had pacing and fear.
Resident Evil 5 was much more terrifying. Take, for example, the very first time you run into the Ouroboros virus creature, the leech creature in the furnace.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's an extremely dark, extremely tight, extremely terrifying, intense moment. Whereas Resident Evil 4 is run through the village, run through the castle. It's all bright and brown in contrast, and then it's dark and gray in contrast. And
you're forgetting the purple. You're forgetting the purple, sir. You are forgetting the purple of Resident Evil 4.
And I'm forgetting the green, but I'm colorblind, so I can't see purple. How dare you?
Resident Evil 5 had very limited aspect to me with the weapon. There's not much to play with in my eyes. Many of the weapons feel useless. The weapon drops, you're not going to randomly encounter ammo that you don't need, which really doesn't give you a reason to purchase specific weapons. It's really just get to the water level, get the rocket launcher, breeze through the rest of the game.
It's half true if you're not trying to have a good time, but take, for instance, good content creator, Dante Ravioli, who plays through Resident Evil 4 and 5, challenging himself to play in different ways. As the player, it's not the developer's fault that you didn't replay their masterpiece.
Is it a masterpiece, though? Like,
it really,
let's dive into the story a little bit. I mean, Shiva was extremely forgettable.
No, everybody wants Shiva to make a comeback. That's, maybe not the most interesting interactive character in the series, right? She's the Carlos to Chris. At the same time, it's not a character that you don't want to see again. It's a character you still have questions about, because where does Shiva really come from? What's up with the military service tattoo on her arm? Why is she even involved in any of this to begin with? There are questions left open, and I think that leaves a lot of interest for the player.
Yeah, but doesn't that also just lead a tight-ended game that could have existed into an Undertale type of scenario where the community can just write their own AU?
Of course they can, but Resident Evil is an ever-evolving series. There's never a plot hole that Capcom isn't willing to fill at some point in the future. Resident Evil 6 filled a lot of those plot holes. As much as I don't like that game, it did.
Yeah, but don't you think 5 should have done that?
No. I think 5 was a good reintroduction to Chris Redfield. I think it was good to put him in a similar scenario to Leon Kennedy, because we had seen both of them already in their police scenarios, in tighter, more tense situations. Leon got his time in the spotlight in a more action-oriented setting with a clear mission, and I think Chris deserved that too. Just as a character, as a big character in the series, he really did deserve that too.
But what if I say no? Because the context of Leon's growth makes more sense, where Chris survived Resident Evil 1, and we know almost nothing up to this point of his engagement with the virus.
Except no, because Code Veronica X explains all of that.
Who
Chris
played
was
Code Veronica
kidnapped.
X? Who had a
Everybody
Dreamcube?
played
Who had a Dreamcube? And plus, the gameplay of Code Veronica X was so difficult and old-fashioned.
How do you like that? We're not even criticizing that right now. Regardless.
Hey, if you're allowed to bring up Crash Bandicoot.
Fair enough. I accept.
Yeah,
I
I just
won't
feel
get
like
too
we went from Resident Evil 1 Chris, where we had this Chris Redfield who was inexperienced, but he was still considered a veteran of stars in some sense of the word, along with Albert Wesker being a quote-unquote veteran of the stars. The
This is
story up to this point is that we understand that Wesker set them up at the Spencer Mansion. How did we go from Chris barely being able to manage a knife to him being a hunk lord, beast lord, punching boulders? Like, there was
Resident
no...
Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 explains some of those things because Claire is looking for Chris, doesn't find Chris, discovers he's been kidnapped and taken to Shadow Island.
Where is Shadow Island? Why we should have a game for Shadow Island that leads up to 5.
I mean, yes, at the same time, no. It really is just one of those things where, like, actually, we did. I think Resident Evil 5's Lost in Nightmares describes that, a portion of that. Like, that's when Jill goes missing. That's when don't quote me on that. I'm not like.
Oh, I'm pulling it up.
At the same time, I'm pretty sure Lost in Nightmares covers all of that.
Lost in Nightmares is a story-based DLC for Resident Evil 5 set during the previous mission, hinted at in a flashback from the game. It is about 1 hour in length, depending on the difficulty. Blah 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 blah. The BSA received a tip-off of the whereabouts of Umbrella's founder, as well E. Spencer. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine are assigned to raid his estate and arrest the elderly man in the hopes he will have information to find
Yeah,
Albert
Lost in
Wesker.
Nightmares. Lost in Nightmares is directly after Chris manages to escape from Shadow Island. So I think that again is Code Veronica though. That's all shit that we do. That's all shit that we discover in Code Veronica. Like, while Claire's story in Code Veronica is being told, Chris's story is being told through notes and documents.
Great, another source of most people not caring.
Again, that's subjective. Like, it really is a fan thing. You don't even have to be a fan of Resident Evil. There are so many people who probably only played Code Veronica and never played any of the others. You know?
It's true.
And vice versa.
And that's another thing about Resident Evil 5 is it's like it's so action oriented. I think a lot of people who are now into Resident Evil are lost and causing issues with the story. You have an opinion on that?
Yes, I think I mean you're partly right. At the same time, you can't really blame like the fandom for the story getting lost, if it ever got lost. I think it's pretty concise. The timeline's not a Zelda timeline, so.
And neither of them are good. The continuity of both games that you just mentioned are bad.
Well, Resident Evil is rewriting itself. We have to give them credit. They're trying to fix these issues.
Yeah, but let's talk about the context of when the game came out.
When the game came out, there were a few plot holes, but that's because Resident Evil, like I said, is an expanding series. They left open a ton of room. Like, had it not been for Rebecca Chambers existing in Resident Evil 1 and us knowing nothing about her, we would have never got Resident Evil 0, which you can say nobody played, but no, everybody who played any early Resident Evil played Resident Evil 0.
I liked Resident Evil 0.
Yeah.
We would be flipping the table if this was Resident Evil 0. You'd be the devil's advocate right now.
That's because I actually don't care for that game.
I love Resident Evil 0. Actually challenging, good enemy design, really unique, tight spaces.
No, save it. Stay tuned for the future.
Right? But I can use that in my argument. Other games that came before it did it better. The Resident Evil 1 remake on the GameCube did Resident Evil 5 better.
They're incomparable games.
They are both Resident Evil.
They're both Resident Evil. They are incomparable games. You can't compare Resident Evil 4 to Resident Evil 1 in that same sense, because just because it shares the name and is a mainline entry does not make it the same game. If we compared Resident Evil 4 to Resident Evil 1, it wouldn't be regarded as one of the greatest games of all time.
It's a valid argument, honestly. Like, actually pretty damn good. There's argument there, but no, you're right. So I'll say this. Much of the mechanics of Resident Evil 5 left me more or less stumped on why that was a design decision. I understood breaking up your characters, right? One goes one way, the other one goes another way. But I also felt like majority of the time it was pointless.
If we're
You're
talking
still
about-
within the same arena with each other. You're not diverting extremely far apart from each other. The game could have done a lot more with the removal of these two characters in co-op and given you back that dread.
So you're talking about something that I can refer us back again to the time it came out. The Resident Evil 5 came out at a time when games were shoehorning in multiplayer where absolutely no multiplayer was necessary, right? So games like God of War Ascension had multiplayer, and that was bad. And games like Far Cry 3 had multiplayer, and that was pretty bad. And it wasn't, this was the start of a generation when multiplayer, online multiplayer specifically, was becoming the biggest thing. Having Resident Evil 5 written around its multiplayer encouraged the multiplayer more. It gave the multiplayer a reason to exist more than the single player, because inherently it's intended to be a cooperative game, right?
It's
And the fact
intended
that
to
it's
be, but
written-
I don't think it works well as one. What is your argument that it works well as one?
Shiva dies constantly in single player. Without a co-op partner, it's infinitely more cheap, honestly. It reinforces, I mean, like, that's not to say the single player is bad. It's just to say that there are some instances in the single player where Shiva not being a cooperative partner is a huge hindrance.
So let's go back to the context of when this game came out, okay? We are at essentially the turning point of the SL internet. A lot of people are buying Xbox 360s and not connecting them to the internet, which we know to be true by the market today. You buy Resident Evil 5, you have a terrible experience with it. Do you blame the game or do you blame the person?
I find a friend and play split screen multiplayer, because split screen multiplayer was still incredibly relevant about this time.
Man, I still say that makes it a bad game. The single player wasn't up to par.
The single player was incredibly up to par. Shiva being an annoyance sometimes is like saying Resident Evil 4 was a bad game because Ashley died cheaply sometimes.
Which is true. Resident Evil 4 was a bad game, which we'll get to.
It really... I can't believe you've done this. I can't believe you've done this.
So, just real quick, because we're at the 20-minute mark, I am playing the devil's advocate here. We are not having a true to heart argument. I am. Well, you are defending the game, and I'm producing artificial arguments for you to defend.
Yeah.
And just one more time, just to reiterate, I'm not actually a huge Resident Evil fan. I love the lore of Resident Evil, but I am a down-to-earth Silent Hill fan, first and foremost. Like, I think Silent Hill is better. It's just my
on
opinion.
the other hand, am a hardcore Resident Evil fan, down to buying every game on every console and every other platform at least once. My
Buying
Nintendo Switch.
all of my Resident Evil games.
Yeah, I bought all of his Resident Evil games. My Nintendo Switch game card case is the Umbrella Corporation logo. I've got all kinds of Resident Evil movies and junk laying around. I'll advocate for it all day.
Okay, and we'll hop back into the argument now.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what are we supposed to presume about Chris at this point? We are at the beginning of the game. You're landing into Africa. You're being toured around by Shiva, and what? Like, there are people there not attacking you. You're in a village. It's set up in such a bizarre way.
It's been years since we've seen Chris, but this is a familiar scenario to the player of Resident Evil 4. Just because it's been years since we've seen Chris does not mean that Chris is unintentionally much more beefy than he was. I mean, the Resident Evil 5 takes place a good, I want to say 10 years after the events of Resident Evil 1, which was the last time we saw him.
Yes.
Right? Whereas Resident Evil 2 to 4 is a much shorter time period.
Mm-hmm.
When we finally do see Chris again, it's in a familiar setting, much like we saw Leon again, right?
Yes.
But it's much more expansive, it's much larger, it's much darker. You can tell that there's a lot more tension in the air. Things are going to be much more aggressive this time.
So you don't think it was a total cop-out?
No, not at all. I think they introduce you to the world in such a way. They show you, before anything attacks you, it doesn't just get straight into the violence and straight into the action. Before anything attacks you, you're toured through the village and you're shown what's happening in front of you. The villagers are brutal. They're beating up on a bag that's moving and squirming. There's bugs and death everywhere. There's rotten meat hanging from things. I mean, it's a really grim scene, but nothing is hostile yet. It's an introduction to what you're walking into. It builds the tension for the next sequence, which pulls you into a massive crowd of extremely hostile enemies. Like, you go from building tension to immediately thrown into the most tense situation you could possibly be in as the player.
And
Right,
I'd
but it's
argue that's bad game design.
No,
Where
no.
with
I would argue-
hang on, let me do my devil's advocate. I would argue that in Resident Evil 4 it does it better, where you're introduced to one character. Leon tries to communicate to him, and then it gives you the ropes of what's happening in a combat and controlling sense.
That's just the thing, right? This is a sequel to Resident Evil 4, so it doesn't have to be that way.
But it's on a brand new system, brand new
at the same-
audience.
At the same time, nobody was buying Resident Evil 5 that wasn't already a fan of Resident Evil 4.
Oh,
And
I'm
if
sure
they
plenty
were,
of people were.
if they were going back to Resident Evil 4 and didn't care for it.
Maybe. That's a lot of speculation on both of
Fair
our
enough.
parts.
Fair enough. Regardless, I think it's still to the returning player. It's a familiar enough situation to feel like it's not impossible to get through this crowd.
No, it definitely didn't feel impossible. I would
No,
say
yeah.
it definitely was overwhelming, and if you weren't used to those controls and that way of playing, that could have been very jarring to newer players, especially people who were not used to an over-shoulder style of combat.
Which goes against the idea that Resident Evil 5 isn't a horror game more so than 4.
I would
4
say
was
it's
very,
not.
4 was very slow in its build-up, and nothing was really all that terrifying. The first enemy dies relatively quick, no matter how you handle it.
Yeah.
Right? And then there are 3, and it gradually builds up to something, and there's really not much tension in regard to that. There's some tension when Verdugo is chasing you in the tunnels, but nowhere near as much tension as just walking through the environments in Resident Evil 5, because at any point, at any time, something terrifying could happen. An enemy could just emerge from a corner out of an alleyway and not even attack you, and it's still an incredibly tense moment, because you don't know if that enemy is going to be more aggressive than the others, right? It's one of those things that, as a horror player, from a horror perspective, it works better than anything Resident Evil 4 did. There's so much just...
Ooh, I have an argument against that.
Okay.
I would definitely disagree in the regard that Resident Evil 4 set up the gore and the situation that you're in better. I feel like Resident Evil 5 was mostly portrayed during daylight, in just these oddly crowded African streets that looked more like an Indian market than anything else. It didn't feel scary to me. Like, at any moment, yes, something could come out of the alleyway and attack me, but the entire game is an action game. Like, all we're doing is running and shooting. So
No.
I would be just prepared for that regardless.
I mean, you could make that argument. I would make the argument that you can't just run and shoot in Resident Evil 5. Watch the speedruns. There's a lot of precision and a lot of strategy that goes into maneuvering Resident Evil 5, whereas Resident Evil 4 is run in a straight line, so you can jump out a window, so you can run in a straight line.
Yeah, but that's in a speedrun settings. In a casual playthrough, the
in a casual
emptiness of
playthrough-
4, right? Okay, let's go into the emptiness of 4. You have areas where it's just building tension, where you don't know when something's going to happen, and I didn't feel that as well with 5. I felt
And see,
the
I think
world is
thematically-
constantly alive.
I think you're right. I think you're right about that. But I think thematically, the emptiness works for Leon as a character, whereas the hard action and the aggression works for Chris.
Well, what if hard action doesn't belong in Resident Evil?
It really does, because it's been an action game from the beginning.
I'd say 1 was scary.
I would disagree heavily. I mean, I would say it was scary, yes, but I would also point to the heavy action-oriented segments like the giant snake fight and the grenade launcher. Like, those aren't things you find in a horror game.
The body horror that occurred during 4 of Salazar being turned into a centipede, for instance, was jarring on so many levels, especially because this is the PS2 era, which is a wonderful argument. But I didn't see much of that on Resident Evil 5. There really wasn't nothing that had that crazy transformation.
Well, there were chest-popping moths. There was Irving's transformation, which I would argue was absolutely sick, right? There's all kinds of just gore around the village in Resident Evil 5. There's the bloody rotten meat hanging around everywhere, and the clothing that's torn and shredded, and the marketplaces that have clearly just been slaughtering grounds.
But I would say that the environment of 5, although it being terrifying, is synonymous with things that happen in the real world. Like those are things that you can see on
which ultimately works toward my argument that it feels like more of a horror game than Resident Evil 4, because the realism of the horror shines through in 5.
See, I feel like it made me feel guilty because I live such a comfortable life.
I feel like I don't feel guilty so much as I feel uncomfortable, because it's made to make you feel like that. The more I'm not one for realism in horror generally, but there's a point when the realism kicks in, and when a horror game uses it just right, it works to its advantage. Resident Evil 5 was disturbing in a lot of areas.
Yes.
But it never made me feel like I was contributing to the problem. It made me feel like I was just trying to get away from it.
I need a second. Okay, getting away from it, right? Here's another wonderful argument on my side. What Resident Evil 4 did extremely well is transitioning. There are many areas in the game where you can see where there is poverty and not poverty. Going into the village, you can see the church, which is extremely ornate and well built. And right out front of it is where these Illuminados were burning a police officer alive. You go past the farm and through a building, and the next scene you're running into what is essentially a mansion. And it's ornate, it's beautiful. And there is this extreme cultural divide that it also discusses, where Salazar and who's the midget? I always forget his name.
Salazar is the midget, Sadler is the bad guy.
Sadler's the bad guy. Okay, so you get to the castle, and then you have all of this extremely unique... I mean, don't get me wrong, the robot was stupid. We'll get to that in Resident Evil 4, guys. But you can see an extreme cultural divide in Resident Evil 4 that shows you that this overlord cult leader is literally just running these villages into poverty, all the while gaining technology and resources and wealth.
I would argue, to that entire point, I would argue Resident Evil 5 moves seamlessly from the African village to the tribal village, where things are vastly different. They're primitive at best, and it's much more grotesque. It's swamp-like, it's more grade. There's a lot of water. It's a lot more navigational based, right?
The
and it's
water.
not all. After that, it seamlessly transitions into the temple environment, which makes sense culturally. It would move if you're moving from one place to the other. It makes sense. Where the Umbrella was conducting tests in this temple area, right? You move in out of that into the more industrial area on the other side, where all of the Umbrella dealings are going down, and Wesker is doing his thing, and Irving is doing his thing, and it all flows, and it's all really diverse. When you get to the industrial area, it's dark, it's more blued. There's a lot of fire going on, but at the same time, there's a lot of green, and it's much more metal than everything else. There's a clear difference between it and the tribal village and the temple and the village you start in. It's just so many, and there's one more area than Resident Evil 4.
Yeah, that's true.
So it wasn't just the same thing again, and it wasn't not the same thing. It was a little bit better than the same thing.
No.
Yes.
No.
It was a little bit longer than the same thing.
There you go. Better?
I think it's better. I'm one of those people who thinks Resident Evil got better up till 5, shat itself at 6, and then 7 was the best.
No. I believe the gun was already pointed at the foot at 5.
No.
They were getting ready to shoot their foot right at the end of 5.
Nope. Everyone loved 5 until 6 came out, and then 5 divided everyone. And, Division kind of seeped its way in as the fandom changed, right? As people came and went, opinions about it changed, and I think the subjectivism of both games really like holds merit. You can hold a torch to both and be like, yeah, it's a good game.
No, it's not.
I mean, because you're a gonk.
Speaking on the terms of Resident Evil 4 one more time, maybe a couple more times, we'll see what happens. There were many other set pieces to Resident Evil 4 that I enjoyed more. The amount of swarm-like events that occur made more sense to Resident Evil 4 when you're grouped up with Lewis inside the house. It just worked for me. Where with Shiva and always having her by your side, those swarm events didn't feel as impactful to the story.
Wow. I feel totally different because when you're in the house with Lewis, Ashley is locked in a closet and is no longer a factor that the player has to manage. You lose gameplay.
We'll come back to this. Because I did not enjoy that fact. We will definitely be revisiting 4, trust me. And I will be playing Devil's Advocate. But you'll be playing Devil's Advocate for 0. Yay! And probably
Yay.
Dead Aim. Ooh.
Yeah, I got some words for Dead Aim.
Dead Aim is the best Resident Evil game made. It's how you do a Resident Evil right.
No, you're wrong.
No,
You're
I'm
very
right.
wrong. You're so wrong. You have no idea how wrong you are.
Bruce is the best character in Resident Evil and deserves more light than Shiva.
No, Golden Luger Boy from Code Veronica is the best character, and
Oh, Claire's
you're
little love
wrong if you
interest?
disagree. Yeah.
Yeah, that dude's awesome. Survivor was incredible. Survivor and Dead Aim are the 2 best Resident Evil games.
At least we can agree that Survivor was good.
Dude, everybody who says Survivor... Okay, anyways, we'll come back to that. That's another topic for another day. Oh my god. Resident Evil 5, though, man, it just... The bosses didn't... They weren't challenging. I mean, of course, once you learn video games and how to manipulate video games, you can make easy work of any boss. Look at any Dark Souls player. But Resident Evil 5, their bosses just... Nothing really eluded a big challenge to me.
Fair enough. I would say that nothing in Resident Evil 4 does that either. Every enemy in Resident Evil, no matter it's a boss or a regular enemy, has a clear weak point. That's just something that the series inherently does to make it more speed-friendly. Because whether it's about speedrunning or not, the game actively times you. Speed is a factor.
Well, I mean, Resident Evil 4 definitely has a lot more with the New Game Plus. That's another conversation of I don't think the New Game Plus of 5 was as good.
That's a conversation that I greatly disagree with. I think Resident Evil 5, it didn't have the Chicago typewriter, but it had more content. And we saw the return of the mercenaries, and there were costumes to unlock just like there are in every Resident Evil. Like I think we got more guns in Resident Evil 5 for beating the game than we did Resident Evil 4. And there were just generally more challenges. Like it wasn't as easy as running through the side mission to unlock something. There were usually conditions you had to meet.
Yeah. But again, like if you want to play apples to apples with Resident Evil 4 and 5, what really did 5 do difference? Other than a new character, a new area, and a different follower.
Well,
in many situations, it's the same game being retold in a different way.
No. Again, no. Just no.
With fighting mechanics?
I already made the argument. Well, shooting is cleaner, running is cleaner. It was the first time we saw the introduction of twin-stick aiming, so you didn't have to play with tank controls.
I think that those things are just a given, though. We're moving to a new generation.
I mean, sure, but those are still things that it did differently and did better. Resident Evil 4's tank controls, as revolutionary as the camera was, were not that great.
Ooh, the camera.
Whereas Resident Evil 5's twin-stick controls feel nice, clean, responsive. It feels like a good third-person shooter. It feels... Topple that in with the extra melee combat for every enemy stagger, being able to chain melee combat together, the wider variety of grenades and other special items, like I bring up again the stun rod, which was an amazing inclusion. The wide variety of guns of every kind, the fact that luring enemies into traps, there was usually a way to get around a trap so you could lure an enemy into a trap, which was something that Resident Evil 4, every enemy was on a fixed path. You really didn't have to guide them around all that much. You know, there was always option in Resident Evil 5. There was so much diversity, whereas Resident Evil 4 is a lot of repetition. It's a lot of the same with better guns as time goes on.
I would say if you played Resident Evil 4 then played Resident Evil 5, it's a lot of the same. I don't think that person, especially with being like an unbiased perspective, of course, they would come back to us and say they're the same game, just one's just more refined.
Let me take off my rose-tinted glasses for a second, coming from the perspective of somebody who's playing through Resident Evil 4 consistently.
Wait, hang
now.
on. Are we
played
dropping
through
Devil's
5.
Advocate?
No.
But you said you're taking off your rose-tinted glasses. The whole point is your rose-tinted glasses.
No, yeah, I know. Let me take off my rose-tinted glasses to defend the game in a different light for a second.
Okay.
Right? As somebody who's playing through Resident Evil 4 and 5 consecutively right now, side by side, I see the subtle differences in 5 that make it a cleaner, more fleshed out experience. It feels more like what Resident Evil 4 could have been if it hadn't been restarted 3 times in development.
That's true. We didn't get to that yet, but yes. Well, we can go into that if you want.
Yeah, let's move into that.
Project Hookman.
Resident Evil 5 only had one beta before the final game, and it was still the exact same game.
Yes, it was. So, something really important for a lot of people to know, we're dropping Devil's Advocate real quick, so I'm not going to be playing Devil's Advocate right now, is Resident Evil 4 had an extremely rocky development. Resident Evil 4 was pretty much the reason why Onimusha and Devil May Cry exist.
Yeah, so the very first Resident Evil 4 was the engine that eventually became the very first Devil May Cry, which evolved into Devil May Cry 2 and then 3.
Yes.
Project Madman, the Hookman arc of that whole story. I played through a fan recreation of that. Let's put that in my YouTube description. It was Clock Tower. I mean, it was Clock Tower, and they knew it was Clock Tower, and it wasn't exactly the best idea, but it was the first we saw of the third-person camera.
Mm-hmm.
So credit where credit is due. Not everything was totally replaced. The Resident Evil 4 we came to know and love did not get the amount of time it deserves, and you can see that in the level design, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, it's not extremely polished. The mapping of the game, you can see all the polygonal assets. If you take reshade into it, there's a lot of broken vertices, but
not even just that. Looking at just the level design itself, you can see from where you go, from a map maker's perspective, because I develop video games. That's pretty common knowledge. It's one of those things that, like, when you look at the first room and then you look at the second room and then you look at the third room, you can clearly tell the developers were still experimenting with things. That these rooms were the final rooms, not because they wanted them to be, but because they had to be.
And again, because we dropped Devil's Advocate and we're talking about Resident Evil 5. Resident Evil 5 did not have that issue, which actually aligned to the maps being way more fleshed out.
Yeah.
When I made my Devil's Advocate of everything looking samey, when you actually explore the game and persistently, the maps are actually pretty well made. Each room feels unique and has purpose.
Which, you are right, it is definitely a problem with Resident Evil 5. There is a lot of spaces that don't feel like they need to exist. There's a lot of... it's much more open-ended, which is something that Resident Evil 4 was lacking. At the same time, those open-ended spaces had the Assassin's Creed syndrome.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And not only that, but Resident Evil 5 doesn't put you in a lot of spaces where you can tell people live in it. A lot of the rooms don't look like people live in it or use it. It just feels abandoned in many senses of the word. But there are still people here.
I can see that. Whereas, like, the village, there's beds, there's shelves, there's tables and dressers, and there's clearly life in the village. And, that's another thing, like, when you see the villagers behaving, when you initially walk in, like, totally dropping Devil's Advocate, when you see the villagers behaving the way they do when you walk in, and you compare that to the way you see the villagers behaving in Resident Evil 5 when you walk in, it really is much of the same. It's the exact same idea. It's just that watching them in Resident Evil 5, they're not immediately hostile.
So, another thing that I also found really interesting, especially with the release date of 5 and 6. If you guys watch my show or have seen me on YouTube, you know that I have spoken positively about Resident Evil 6. And I know, Red, you don't fully agree with this to this date, but everywhere I traveled in Resident Evil 6, whether it was the highway, if you disregard a lot of the extreme action senses and just explore, there is quite a bit to look at. Nothing really felt samey in Resident Evil 6, and I felt like going from 5 to 6, although mechanically wasn't as good unless you mastered the mechanics, then it's a ton of fun.
It's because
I like the environment.
Movie. It's because it was a bad game and a good movie. It was a great tour.
Yeah, it was. It was but when I play a Silent Hill game, I am talking about Silent Hill. Sorry. Every time I play a Silent Hill game, the environment shift. You know what I mean? I can be in the same place, and this same place could have two completely different renders for two different, like, atmospheres, essentially, right? I feel like Resident Evil could have learned a lot from Silent Hill moving forward, and I feel like they did, specifically with Resident Evil 0, where you had the leeches living on the wall, and then Resident Evil 7, they did the mold living on the wall that would fall out of the wall and things like that. Resident Evil 5 didn't really have that for me, which again kind of persisted the idea that we are stepping away from horror and we're moving into action. I kind of foresaw 6 through 5.
I never really foresaw 6 through 5, because there were so many moments in 5 that felt so terrifying. It was less terrifying my second and third time around. I can look back now and think, yeah, it's not all that scary, but I can think the same thing about Silent Hill 2 because I've been through it so many times.
Yeah, but your first time through Silent Hill or Silent Hill 2, it's the atmosphere, it's the setup, it's the sound of the monsters, not knowing exactly where they are.
And that's why I felt like Resident Evil 5 did good, because the first thing you see is the villagers behaving like villagers, and then the next thing you see is the villagers beating on a squirming bag, and then the next thing you see is a weapons trader selling you weapons because there's a huge biological terror going on.
Yeah,
like the buildup is quick, but
the setup for Resident Evil 5 is there. It's two parts for me. Okay, so in Resident Evil 4, we're set up that Leon is just being issued to save Ashley. They don't know that she's been kidnapped per se. They have an idea, and as you relay information, the person that you're communicating with doesn't contact you as frequently. Things are getting jammed. You can't communicate outside, right?
Whereas Chris always has his team on hand.
Yes. I always felt like I would, where is the, for a lack of a better explanation, the hunk squad? Why is Chris only with Shiva?
Well, that again is something that you have to kind of pay attention to the beginning of Resident Evil 5 to understand. You see the hunk kind of squad and what happened. They weren't Hunk and his squad, but the BSAA squads that had been sent in before Chris and Sheva, the non-specialist squads, were all slaughtered. When you finally meet up with the guy and you recover the document, he's barely alive, barely breathing, just enough to give you the document. Everybody got fucking annihilated, which is exactly why they called in Chris Redfield.
I'm setting him up to discuss this. Okay. It's just so people know.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also see that throughout the story, especially with like Resident Evil 3, where the introduction cutscene shows a lot of these umbrella defects, essentially, fighting the zombie outbreak.
And just getting slaughtered.
And getting wrecked, Putting themselves in terrible positions and getting wrecked. Again, with Shiva, why is Shiva there is a great question you presented earlier. Shiva should have been fully fleshed out, in my opinion, and has been left behind.
That in the same regard is just like Rebecca Chambers. It took a long time for them to recognize Rebecca Chambers.
Oh, the importance of Rebecca Chambers in modern gaming is she needs to be discussed.
Yeah.
She's extremely important. We know she's extremely important. Rebecca Chambers has not been discussed since
We are about to get another Resident Evil 4 movie, that takes place just after Resident Evil 4, that will explain some of the lore a little bit more about everybody,
Mhm.
and that'll probably close up some things about Sheva, but it also might not because it's years before they ever meet. At the same time, we also still don't have any information other than the Dark Side Chronicles. We don't have any information about Krauser, and he's an extremely interesting character that I'd like to know more about. I would have liked to see him and Leon in a regular game environment.
Oh, absolutely.
There's another character like Billy Cohen. I need to see Billy Cohen again, otherwise I'm going to continue to think they made him into something.
Well, Resident Evil 0 left us empty in many regard. And if you have more information, please drop it down in the comment section below, and I would happily look into it. But Resident Evil 0 left us empty. And I think Resident Evil 5 is following suit, where we're leaving Sheva empty. Like, she has become an unimportant character for no reason. She could have been something.
To that point, why does Jake Wesker exist, and where did he come from?
That's a great question.
What
What happened with Outbreak 1 and 2? Where are they?
Yeah, exactly. These characters that exist, that comes back to what I said about Resident Evil being an ever-expanding series. They purposely leave open a lot of room for new stories and new development.
Mhm.
It's a creative decision.
Yeah, of course. And I used the example of Undertale earlier with AU environments where people generate their own fandom and create their own facts, essentially.
Yeah.
I think that's okay, especially with a major organization like Capcom, where it's not as good for, say, Toby Fox with Undertale. Capcom can allow the fandom to create their own stories, and I think it's good to have games like Dead Aim, Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 0, allow us to kind of create our own architectural points of a story.
To that,
It keeps people interested.
To that, I think Capcom does a great job of servicing fans when it comes to that regard.
Mhm.
Resident Evil, when people said Resident Evil 4 was amazing and they wanted more Resident Evil 4, we got Resident Evil 5, which was
To note, I didn't say that.
with more. The fans of Resident Evil 4 wanted more Resident Evil 4. You're just a gonk.
Well, I was a fan of Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3. We've discussed this several times, and I felt like, this is not devil's advocate anymore, guys. I felt like Resident Evil 3 was when I lost interest in the game.
The action had shown through in Resident Evil 3.
Yes.
More so than it did in the last two.
My
Like,
older
whether or
brother
Go ahead.
loved Resident Evil 4, right? So I have beaten Resident Evil 4. God,
It's hard to count these days.
a lot. I've beaten it on like 6 consoles, like 30 times each. And I could easily tell you that game is unrememberable to me. There are many areas of the game that I've seen you go through in your speedruns, and I have no idea where you are. But it's the same thing with Resident Evil 5.
It's so hilarious that you say that, right? Because I never get past chapter 2. You don't recognize anything.
Yeah, not much of the game is much there to remember.
That's fair. Which is, I agree, right? Which is why I think I like Resident Evil 5, because I'm always going to remember lighting the leech monster on fire in the furnace.
Well, it's just like Resident Evil 0. Like, there's so much I remember about 0 because it just felt more impactful to me. The whole entire thing of just having one protagonist, and it's this defect from the Spencer Mansion, he's angry and he's doing these terrible things, was interesting to me. And the fact that took place before and kind of during Resident Evil 1 was super interesting to me because it showed that, okay, yes, Albert Wesker equals bad guy, but he's not alone. There are other bad things to worry about.
Yeah. Which, okay, fair enough. In Resident Evil 4, where there's one clear villain, it's Resident Evil 5, there's multiple villains grasping for the exact same power.
That's not what I said. 4 has like 6 villains.
Does it though?
I mean,
does it really though?
They set up Krauser, they set up Salazar, they set up
Those are all-
Sadler.
You can make that argument. I would make the argument that they all link back to Sadler as the main villain, whereas in Resident Evil 5, Irving is his own pawn with his own plan. All right, and Wesker is his own pawn with his own plan.
Yeah. But, I mean, Salazar had his own plan. We wouldn't have Resident Evil 5 without Salazar. And Leon just destroys him.
Salazar had a pseudo plan, kind of, but you gotta remember once the Plaga is in the body, whether or not Salazar was a special kind was still under Sadler's control.
Yes, but it was still his family.
Yeah.
It was Salazar's family that pretty much wanted the progenitor virus and was protecting it, essentially.
Say what you will about that. All right. Resident Evil 5's Irving comes from an organization that we haven't seen much of. Wesker was set up beautifully in Resident Evil 5 through Resident Evil 4.
Yes, he was.
Like, there's a Resident Evil 4, for all of the setup it did, never really closed a lot of those setups, and I think that ultimately holds it it holds it back in the same regard as you were saying earlier with Resident Evil 5's story. You know?
Yeah. Which
it's
real quick. You guys are watching Devil's Advocate. Right now, we are not doing the Devil's Advocate, but previously what you saw with Devil's Advocate, a lot of those opinions were not actually my own. They were fabricated just to create tension for him to have things to discuss upon.
Whereas every single one of my opinions right now have been actually my opinions.
Yes. That's the point of Devil's Advocate. Just so everybody's aware, it's the first episode, so we just want people to be perfectly clear on what's happening.
Yeah. And we're, 30, 40 minutes in now?
52.
Wow.
Yeah, we're reaching the end. We have 7 minutes.
All right, so we make closing arguments.
No, there really aren't any closing arguments for me. I would say, in today's day and age, 2021, if you have the few bucks that it costs, go to G2A, go to CD Keys, because I doubt Capcom's making any money off of it these days. You know, grab the $6 game, get one of your buddies to get it. There's a quick fix on Steam to play it online still, and play it. It's really good. It's a ton of fun to run with your buddies. The laughs that you can get from this game are just incredible. There are so many scenes in this game that will have you rolling in your seat, and there are also scenes in this game that will make you, reel back in horror. There are scenes that will make you extremely uncomfortable.
If you're a first-time Resident Evil player, if you're unfamiliar, Resident Evil 5 is a great starting point.
Mm-hmm.
It really is a good introduction to the series. It's one of those games that'll make you want to play more of them.
Yes. Also, if you're watching this and you've never played Resident Evil before, thank you for watching, and share the video, please. Help us reach more people.
How did you get here?
Yeah. Hopefully somebody shared it to you to make you want to play it. That would be really cool.
Yeah.
There's a lot there for Resident Evil 5 for people to enjoy. The game to this date has aged pretty well. I would argue that there are some mechanics in the game that have aged poorly, but that's with any game. I mean, when did Resident Evil 5 come out? Do you know?
2008.
2008. There you go. Like the lighting, the hard light in that game is pretty brutal.
At the same time, we didn't have RTX 3010s,
30
Ti's, fucking, and Intel Core i9 9000 XEK.
Yeah. But we did have technology that was more than capable to run this game. The game was obviously designed with PlayStation Plus, which was just PlayStation Internet, and Xbox Live in mind.
At the exact same time, credit where credit is due, Resident Evil 5 is the best DirectX 9 game. The best looking DirectX 9 game. The normalization maps, the specular mapping in Resident Evil 5 is absolutely gorgeous for DirectX 9. Some of the high poly meshes I didn't even think were possible in that API. It just doesn't make sense how good it looks.
But that definitely has a negative aspect as well in the game, because some of the map terrain is bad. My computer screen just shut off. Not sure why that just happened.
Mine did that a couple of times.
So yeah, if you guys have the time, I would recommend this game. Like, even though I was the devil advocate of the negative side of this conversation, it is worth a glance.
Yeah. To that same argument, don't play Lost in Nightmares. I brought that up earlier. Just don't. Just don't.
See, I would argue the opposite. Play it. Get that experience.
If you feel like you want to, yeah, it's a lot closer to a classic Resident Evil experience. Most people who've played Resident Evil 5 already have played that, right? So
Yes.
to a new player, I feel like if you're interested in more Resident Evil after you play 5, then Lost in Nightmares is worth it. Or if you can land the gold edition that comes with it really cheap.
Yeah, the gold edition is extremely cheap. You can find that extremely cheap. Yeah. I think it's like $6. I mean, yeah, you're not losing anything by not playing this game, in my opinion. I don't see the story really mattering too much moving forward. If you're looking back at this game from a Resident Evil 7 and you're excited for Resident Evil 8, I would say stick to those games, personally, unless you're interested in the third-person perspective co-op kind of experience.
Yeah. If you're coming from Resident Evil 7 and you're more interested in that, you're probably not gonna have as good a time with Resident Evil 5 or 4 or 6. Whereas, it was the exact same story with Resident Evils 1, 2, and 3 when 4 came out.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that, like, people who played 4 for the first time went back and played classic Resident Evil and had no fucking idea what to do. Had no idea what was going on. It was totally unfamiliar.
Now, to put on my devil's advocate to your statement, this is just a quick one. Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 are definitely worth your time.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And if you're gonna play 2 and 3, and you do love the franchise after playing something like 7, and you're like, yeah, I'm all in, I want to know what's going on. Well, A, you're never gonna know what's going on because there are so many side stories, and there's just lore everywhere that even him and I, extremely experienced Resident Evil players who have probably thousands of hours of this game under our belt at this point, get lost in this lore. Don't expect solid continuity from the story. It's sadly just not there.
There are, if you need good explanations for things or more insight on Resident Evil 4 in a quicker fashion, there are tons of good content creators that do Resident Evil content. Bakba Soup is a great one. Residents of Evil does a lot of really good stuff. Dante Ravioli he does other stuff, but he makes good meme videos. And a lot of the things he does, believe it or not, turn out very useful if you're going back and...
Definitely.
If
and
you
they
ever
don't
need more
ignore...
it exists.
They don't seem to ignore games like Dead Aim Survivor, Code Veronica X, and Darkside Chronicles. They're willing to play the Wii on-rail shooter games and look at what was changed, where a lot of people aren't willing to make that change. They're not willing to say, oh, the continuity has changed, because this game tells a different story.
Yeah. But that's another great reason to go looking for insight from other content creators too. Is you can clear a lot up by knowing exactly what is different between the two and kind of cross-referencing why those things might be different, right?
Yeah.
There's always an explanation as to why something was changed, and most of the time it makes sense. Most of the time,
I've always had this theory. I've always had this theory. I've never presented it on video, so this is kind of a one-time for me. For those of you who have made it through the 1 hour content here, I've always had this theory that Resident Evil takes place in a far long future after the events of all of the games, right? Where everything that we're being told is through dossiers. It's a story being told about a story. They're putting together the fragments from dossiers.
Which is where Resident Evil 7 comes into place.
And that's where it seems to come into place, yes.
Yeah,
We'll see more moving forward.
Oh, after this is done, Ian, I have something about Resident Evil 7 to show you that's going to totally change your perception on Ethan Winters and the lore. Just a small 5-second cutscene that changes everything.
Also, Resident Evil content is going to be probably really big between Red and I. We talk about Resident Evil a lot. We do have plans on doing tons of different games.
I'm attempting to speedrun Resident Evil 4 almost on the daily these days.
Check out his YouTube channel if you're interested in that.
Yeah.
Red.
Or if you're
Barrel.
watching this on the YouTube channel, you're already here.
Oh, no, I don't know what channel they're on. And I also speedrun, but I play completely different games, and I do like wacky one-handed blindfolded runs and weird shit.
Doing
'Cause-
police knots right now, which
Yeah.
is just really good.
Hideo Kojima's Police Knots, so good.
Seriously, check
All
it
right,
out.
I know.
He's a good content creator, guys.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll be talking about Resident Evil a lot moving forward with the franchise. And I will be playing the Devil's Advocate for a lot of that because Red, like he said, is a super fan, where I am not. And it'll be interesting to see him play the Devil's Advocate for Silent Hill, especially Silent Hill 3.
I hate that game so bad.
I love Silent Hill 3. Not mechanically.
I just think it's bad. I just think it's bad everywhere. It's
I'm
bad.
excited for you to play Silent Hill Shattered Memories again, and then do Devil's Advocate for that.
I'm kind of excited to play it again too, because I know my opinion is going to change from when I was younger.
Oh, it's bad.
My final words about Resident Evil 5. This podcast, very much like Resident Evil 5, was a good starting point.
Yeah, it was.
We got to talk a lot about it. I got asked some interesting questions and got to say some interesting things, make some interesting points. There are a lot of Resident Evil fans that would disagree with a lot of what I said.
Yes,
Like
absolutely.
a lot of what I said.
I'm sure there are a lot of Resident Evil fans who agree with my Devil Advocate acting role. I think there's going to be people who say, yeah, Ian's right in this regard.
And that's fine. Because at the end of the day, it's all subjective.
Oh, of course. And that brings us to the end of the stream. This is a subjective stream that allows people to explore things without true arguments. Show that you can have a different opinion without arguing and becoming spiteful or hateful with those opinions. We find that the YouTube is saturated with a lot of negative content about video games, but we wanted to show that it's okay to have different opinions and still be friends with people.
Gaming is made to be very inclusive. The whole goal at the end of the day is to bring everybody together, whether it's a single player or a multiplayer game. And having differing opinions on things is important to that dynamic. Whether you love it or hate it, Resident Evil 5 exists, and somewhere out there loves it, and someone out there hates it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't really care for Undertale.
But that's a story for another day.
Absolutely is a story for another day. Yeah. So, you know, if you don't like something and somebody else does, whether it's Warzone, PUBG, Fortnite, just remember that it's fine. Nobody's making you change your opinion because of it.
Yeah. Your opinion is still valid as your opinion. It always is.
With that, let's close it up.
Yeah.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you guys so much for watching.
Yeah, just check out all of the links in the description. Every single one. I don't know what Ian's going to have down there, but I'm going to have a ton of shit. There's going to be Resident Evil lore and other content creators that I referenced, and the fandom wiki, and a bunch of other shit. And Ian's page will be right at the top, and our sound guy who didn't play any sounds will be right there at the
He's
top.
not even here.
That's so sad. He
I think,
left right
yeah.
at the start.
I think he got dragged off because he got invited to go play Apex Legends or something.
Fair.
I think he's streaming actually.
I'll still put his
it's
thing.
fine.
I'll still put his thing in the thing because go support. He's a good content creator.
Yeah, he has some good stuff as well. Definitely interesting stuff. So I'm just gonna let the music play and
Yeah.
we're gonna shut up.